Hi, it's Kaylee, and this is everything I know about the Donner Party. What they ate, how they cooked it, and my mom's husband, Neal D's connection to it. The Donner Party is commonly described as a group of pioneers who became trapped in the mountains and ate each other. While this is technically accurate, the same way that is describing the Titanic as a transportation delay is technically accurate. Because the Donner Party did not begin with cannibalism, it became with optimism. It began with promotional literature that allegedly blasted out social pressure and delayed decision making and grew of people who gradually were losing the ability to reverse course. By the time human remains were consumed, the travelers had already eaten their livestock, dogs, scraps of hide, pieces of leather, and animal bones that had previously been boiled, scraped, burned, and boiled again. The cannibalism was not the beginning of the disaster. It was a final stage of system collapsing. And my interest in the story is not completely abstract. While researching Neal D's ancestry, I found a parent family line intersects with one of the Donner Party survivors through marriage. Not a direct descendant, not inherited guilt, not a hereditary appetite, a genealogical connection. Before we reach Neal's family tree, we need to understand how a group of relatively ordinary immigrants became one of the most infamous dinner party in American history. This is everything I know about the Donner Party. Chapter 1. They were not doomed when they left. In April of 1846, several families departed Springfield, Illinois, and intended to settle in California. They were participating in a much larger migration towards the western United States. California was marketed as a place of fertile land, an opportunity, and social reinvention. The core group included the families of George and Jacob Donner and James and Margaret Reed. They are not initially starving, destitute, or wandering without a plan. Several members possessed considerable property. They brought wagons, livestock, household goods, tools, and hired drivers and servants. James Reed reportedly traveled with a especially elaborate wagon. It had sometimes been described as kind of a frontier place wagon, which perhaps was the first sign that the trip was being approached with slightly more confidence and humility. The exact number of people described as belonging to the Donner Party varies, because travelers joined and separated or left the company at different stages. The National Park Service uses a figure of 87 people from the beginning of the Donner Reed trek and reports that approximately 40 died from starvation-related causes. Other historical accounts differ slightly depending on what membership is measured. It matters because the Donner Party is not a fixed organization. It's a moving collection of families, employees, and unattached travelers whose relationships change throughout the journey. Chapter 2. The Shortcut. The central decision was the choice to take the Hastings cutoff. Lansford Hastings promoted a supportedly faster route to California through the Wasatch Mountains and across the Great Salt Lake Desert. The problem was that the route had not been adequately tested for a large wagon train. At Fort Laramie, experienced traveler James Clement reportedly warned James Reed to remain on the established trail. Reed continually supported the shortcut. When the immigrants reached Fort Bridger, they expected Hastings to meet them and guide them personally. He was not there. He left instructions. Later, when Reed relocated him, Hastings did not return to lead the entire company. The immigrants were left to cut and construct portions of their own wagon road and through difficult terrain. The alleged shortcut therefore became an infrastructure project. They cleared brush, they cut down trees, they moved rock, they widened paths for wagons. Every day spent manufacturing the route was a day removed from the remaining window before winter. Then came the Great Salt Lake Desert. The crossing lasted several days and reached roughly 80 miles. Animals weakened, died, or disappeared. Wagons were abandoned. Water was scarce. The shortcut did not save time. It consumed time, animals, supplies, and group confidence. It did not guarantee the party would become trapped. When it was destroyed, it was a margin for error. Chapter 3. How a group becomes a disaster. The Donner Party story is often presented as humans versus nature. The framing is incomplete. Snow does not choose a shortcut. Snow does not distribute food. Snow does not decide which travelers belong to a restricted family unit and which travelers merely hire labor. Before the group reached the Sierra Nevada, its social structure was already deteriorating. During an altercation near the Humboldt River, James Reed killed John Snyder, a teamster employed by the Graves family. Accounts differ regarding the precise circumstances where the Reed acted in self-defense. The group banished Reed rather than executing him. Reed traveled ahead towards California, leaving his wife, children for the wagon and wagon train. He would later become involved in efforts to rescue them. Another member disappeared or died. Livestock was stolen or lost. Travelers increasingly focused on their own families and property. This is what makes the Donner Party sociology story rather than merely just a weather story. The wagon train is a temporary society. It needs leadership, it needs trust, it needs shared expectations concerning labor, punishment, and ownership of mutual obligation. Once those expectations are begin collapsing, the group does not merely have fewer supplies, it has fewer reasons to cooperate. Chapter 4, The Snow. By late October 1846, the emigrants approached the Sierra Nevada, exhausted and dangerously late. An early snowstorm obstructed the mountain pass. The majority of party shelters near Truckee Lake, now known as Donner Lake. The Donner families had several others that remained approximately 6 or 7 miles away at Alder Creek. The conditions at the two locations were not identical. Some people near the lake had access to distant cabins. At Alder Creek, the shelters were crude structures made from branches, fabric, and coats, other available materials. The snow deepened. Firewood became more difficult to obtain. The travelers became too weak to perform labor required to keep themselves alive. Patrick Bren, who sheltered near the lake with his wife and 7 children, kept a diary from November 20th, 1846 through March 1st, 1847. His entries describe the weather, disappearing food, deaths, and use of animal hides as sustenance. The diary is especially important because it was written during the events rather than reconstructed decades later. It became increasingly sparse. At certain points, history stops sounding literary. It becomes a wording of weather, hunger, and names disappearing. Chapter 5, What They Ate First. Popular culture often jumps directly from snow to cannibalism. The actual progression was slower. It began with the provisions they had carried. They killed and then consumed their own living cattle, oxen, horses, and mules. They ate ordinary cuts of meat first, then organs, then scraps, marrow, whatever fat remained. They reportedly consumed dogs and small animals. Archaeological evidence from Alder Creek includes remains from cattle, horses, deer, dogs, rabbits, and rodents. They were not ignoring available animals because they had preferred something more theatrical. They were exhausting every possible source of calories. The animal bones were extremely intensive processing. They were cut, chopped, broken, burned, boiled, revisited, and reduced in increasingly smaller fragments. The archaeological records do not show people carelessly discarding meals. It showed them returning to the same animal remains repeatedly because every remaining trace of grease or marrow mattered. Chapter 6, How They Cooked the Hides. When the meat was gone, the hides became food. Animal skins were normally used as roofing, bedding, equipment, protection from the weather. Now all these objects have been converted back into calories. The hides were scraps to remove hair and debris. They were cut into smaller pieces. They were soaked or boiled in an attempt to soften them. Boiling could release gelatin from collagen. This is not equivalent to producing nutritious meat broth. The resulting substance would have to be tough, glue-like, and extremely difficult to chew. Some hides may have also contained dirt, smoke, decay, and substance-induced dirt processing. Accounts also mention attempts to eat old buffalo robes. The fact that something originated from an animal does not make it useful food source after being used as an object. At this stage, eating served 2 purposes. The first was obtaining whatever minimal nutrition remained. The second was trying to get the physical sensation of hunger, trying to quiet that. Patrick Bren's diary recorded groups reliant on saw hides. The Donner children later recall eating boiled hides, sperm bones, and mice. They also described chewing bark twigs not because the wood had suddenly become nourishing, because it prolonged starvation changes in the relationship between the body and the idea of food. Chapter 7. How they cook the bones. The bone processing may have been the clearest physical evidence of the group's desperation. Ordinarily, an animal bone may be boiled once for broth and broken to obtain marrow, but at Alder Creek, some bones appeared to have undergone repeated processing. Researchers found cut marks, chop marks, impact damage, and extremely small fragments. Some pieces showed evidence of the pot as pot polish. As pot polish refers to smooth, shiny areas that can develop when bone fragments move against the inside of a cooking vessel while being boiled. Some fragments had been exposed to heat more than once. The probable sequence was something like this. The animal was butchered, the meat was consumed, the bones were broken for marrow, the fragments were boiled to extract grease, the remains were burned or charred, and some of the charred bone itself was crushed or eaten. This was not cooking in the ordinary domestic sense. It was a chemical extraction performed by starving people with household tools. They were trying to learn the structure of an animal into something that a human digestive system could use. Researchers examining the bones described a level of processing consistent with extreme starvation. Nothing nutritious had been left for scavenging animals. The humans are already eating it. Chapter 8. Folklore and Hope. In December, a group left the mountain camps with homemade snowshoes to seek help. The name was Folklore and Hope. It was applied later. It sounds poetic. It was not. The travelers suspected a journey lasting approximately a week. Instead, they became disoriented and remained in the mountains for roughly a month. Their food disappeared, they became snowblind, exhausted, and hypothermic. Several members died, and the survivors eventually consumed some of the people who already died. Accounts indicate the flesh was removed from the bodies and preserved for travel. Some remains were reportedly roasted, boiled, or dried. The members attempted to separate portions so the people would not knowingly consume close relatives. That detail remains important. Even the taboo had been crossed. Kinship continued organizing behavior. They were not operating without social rules. They were constructing emergency rules inside situations which ordinary rules could no longer keep them alive. At first, cannibalism involved people who already died from exposure or starvation. But then the situation changed. Chapter 9. Luis and Salvador. Two indigenous men, Luis and Salvador, had traveled and assisted members of the party. They reportedly refused to eat human flesh. When discussions began concerning whether they might be killed for food, William and Eddie warned them they left the group. They had gone for days without food. When William Foster located them, Foster shot both men. Their bodies were consumed. This cannot be described simply as passive survival cannibalism. Luis and Salvador did not die naturally before their remains were used. They were killed. Their deaths reveal a hierarchy operating within the starving group. Family members were protected, kinship saved, who could be eaten by whom. The indigenous men were treated as comparatively expendable. The donor party therefore cannot be told as a universal story about what humans might do to survive. It's also a Pacific American story about whose life was considered valuable during westward expansion. Luis and Salvador helped the immigrants. When the system had collapsed, the position outside the settlers' family networks made them vulnerable. Chapter 10. What human remains were reportedly cooked like. This is a section where responsible history becomes difficult. Cannibalism occurred. That is not the serious disputed of the historical record. Many of the most graphic individual claims came from newspapers, later interviews, and recollection records years after the event. Some witnesses changed their accounts. Some were children during the winter. Some journalists had obvious incentives to sensationalize the story. Report preparation methods included roasting, broiling, stewing, and drying flesh so it can be carried during travel. One later account attributed to Jean-Baptiste Trudeau described remaining being eaten raw, stewed, and roasted. Trudeau's statement changed over time, making precise details difficult to verify. The distinction is important. We can say human remains were consumed, then we can't say the flesh was cut from the bodies and in some cases cooked or dried. We cannot responsibly present lurid 19th century description of equitable and reliable. The early press transformed disaster into entertainment and almost immediately. Graphic claims told newspapers and allowed the public to treat the survivors as a separate category of people, not starving immigrants, cannibals. Once that label existed, every rumor became plausible. Chapter 11. Did everyone eat human flesh? No. The phrase the Donner Party practiced cannibalism doesn't mean every member participated. The travelers were separated across different shelters and camps. Different families had different resources. Death occurred at different times. Some people escaped before the worst period. Some survivors denied eating human remains. Some children may have been given food without being told what it is. In Brenn's family, especially notable because Patrick and Margaret Brenn, 7 of their children survived. The Reed family also survived intact. Survival depended particularly on age, physical condition, family size, and access to food, and protection provided by kinship networks. The label of the Donner Party flattened these differences. It transferred the actions of some adults onto every person associated with the wagon train, including infants and very young children. This is what stigma does. It converts complicated population into a single contaminated identity. Chapter 12, what archaeology can and cannot prove. For archaeologists excavating the Alder Creek site found thousands of burned fragments of animal bones. Identified species include cattle, horse, deer, and dog. The documented systems chopping, burning, and breakage and boiling, the tested fragments did not produce confirmed identification of human bones. This has occasionally been reduced to the claim that cannibalism never happened. That is not what the research means. The absence of identified human bone at one excavated site does not erase survivor accounts, rescuer observation of cannibalism among the folklore and hope. Human flesh could have been removed from the bones without being cooked. Remains could have been processed at an area that was not excavated. The bones could have been displaced, destroyed, or left elsewhere. Many of the recovered fragments were too damaged or too small to identify by a species. Archaeology is physical evidence. Testimony is historical evidence. Neither is automatically perfect. The strongest conclusion is that the archaeological records confirm extreme starvation and intensive animal processing at Alder Creek. It does not independently confirm the cooking of human bones there. The wider historical records nevertheless establish that cannibalism occurred during the disaster. Chapter 13, the rescues. The first relief party reached the stranded immigrants in February 1847. But then they had been trapped for months. The rescuers could not simply place everyone into vehicles and drive away. Every survivor had to walk through deep snow. Food had to be carried in. Children had to be carried out. The researchers themselves had faced exhaustion, weather, and limited supplies. Not everyone could leave in the first attempt. People who appeared strong enough to travel began the journey and collapsed. Some were left at temporary camps, while rescuers continued with the people still able to move. This created a series of morally unbearable calculations. Taking one weaker person could slow down the entire group. Leaving that person could mean death. Multiple relief expeditions entered the mountains. Some survivors died after rescue had technically begun. Others remained near the lake at Alder Creek until March or April. And of the approximate 87 people commonly counted members of the party, 40 died from starvation-related causes. The difference between surviving and dying was sometimes a few days, a family connection, or a rescuer's willingness to remain behind. Chapter 14, who survived? Women and children generally survived at higher rates than adult men. Several explanations have been proposed. Men often performed the most physical demanding labor during the journey. They cut roads, handled livestock, hunted, gathered wood, and attempted difficult crossings. Some men entered the winter already depleted. Larger bodies require more calories. Women may have carried greater average body fat reserves and lower caloric requirements. Our biology is not our only factor. Women were more likely to be embedded in family units. Many of the attached adults were male employees, drivers, or laborers. A person with a spouse, parents, siblings, or children had people motivated to share food and provide care. A hired worker becomes social isolated once the employment relationship stops functioning. The Donner Party therefore illustrates a principle at many disasters. Resources matter, physical strength matters, but belonging also matters. A person survives partly through the number of people who consider a person indispensable. Chapter 15. This was not empty wilderness. The popular version of a westward migration imagined settlers confronting an unoccupied landscape. Sierra Nevada was not unoccupied. Indigenous people possessed generations of knowledge concerning the region, its seasons, and food sources. The immigrants' suffering was real, but they are also participants in a process of settlement and territorial expansion. The same cultures that portrayed Western land as available for possession frequently treated indigenous knowledge as secondary, indigenous life as disposable. Luis and Salvatore's death are not separated from that context. They assisted the immigrants, and then they were murdered for their bodies to become useful to the group. A complete account has to resist two simple narratives. First, say the immigrants were heroic pioneers, defeated only by nature. The second says they were uniquely foolish monsters who deserved what happened. They were people participating in colonial migration who become trapped inside a catastrophic party caused by misinformation, ambition, and delayed intervention. Victimhood is one context and does not raise the power in another. Chapter 16. Media created the Donner Party. The survivors did not leave the mountains and return to a normal anonymity. Newspapers quickly circulated accounts of cannibalism. Some reports were sympathetic, others were openly sensational. The public began fixated on whether people had been eating relatives, murder companions, undeveloped taste for human flesh. Louis Kelsberg became a particular target of public hatred. He was accused of murder and portrayed as someone who preferred human flesh. The evidence is for the most extreme accusation had weak or contradictory, but Kelsberg had openly acknowledged cannibalism, making him an ideal character onto the public who can transfer entire event on. The survivors spent decades negotiating the stigma. Some avoided discussing the journey. Some distanced themselves from the Donner name. Eliza Donner Hostin, who had been a small child during a disaster, later published a memoir under her Donner name and sought to correct stories about her family. By the time the Pioneer Monument was dedicated in 1918, a cultural meaning had shifted. The people who treated the degraded cannibals could now be remembered as courageous pioneers. The fact had not fundamentally changed. The national mythology had. America had become more comfortable celebrating westward expansion, so the story was edited to emphasize endurance rather than appetite. Chapter 17. My stepdad's connection, Neal D. Knight's family connection. This brings me to Mr. Neal D. Knight. Before explaining the connection, I made a certain level of clarity clear. The modern family line is supported by local obituary index. The older generations reconstructed the public cemetery memorials and collaborative genealogy databases. These sources can be useful, but they also can produce errors. A full certified genealogy requires confirming every generation through original birth, death, marriage, census, probate, and church records. So this is not a statement that every link has been independently proven. It's a strong genealogical lead. The working line is Neal D. Knight, son of George Allen Knight. The local Forest Grove obituary index identifies George's wife as Vivian J. Holmes, and their listed children as Neil, Brent, Keith, Mark, Nanette, and Lois. Their records strongly confirm that this is the correct Neil and the correct immediate family. Public memorials identify George Allen Knight's parents as Cyrus Raymond Knight and Elijah Alvaretta Moore Knight. The line appears to continue through Elijah's mother, Rosa Ellen Perry Moore. Rosa's mother was Charlotte Christine Cyrus Perry. Charlotte was the daughter of William Cyrus. Public genealogy and memorial records consistently place Charlotte as William Cyrus's daughter. Now we reach the Donner Party connection. William Cyrus had a younger brother named John Cyrus. John Cyrus married Lovina Graves. Lovina was the daughter of Franklin and Elizabeth Graves. She traveled west with the Graves family as a child and became one of the survivors of the Donner Party. She was rescued by the First Relief and settled in California with John Cyrus. Historically, the genealogical sources identify William and John Cyrus as brothers and identify Lovina Graves as John's wife. So the relationship is not Neal descended from the Lavina Graves. The relationship is Neal's apparent third grandfather, William Cyrus, was a brother of Lavina Graves' husband, John Cyrus. That would make Lavina Graves Cyrus Neal's distant grandaunt by marriage, more specifically his apparent third grandaunt by marriage. It goes Neal D. Knight, George Allen Knight, Elia Alverda Moore Knight, Rosa Ellen Perry Moore, Charlotte Christine Cyrus Perry. Then William Cyrus, which was the brother of John Cyrus, husband of Lavina Graves Cyrus, and a Donner Party survivor. That means the accurate version is Neal D. Knight's reconstructed family tree appears to connect by marriage to Donner Party survivor Lavina Graves Cyrus. The inaccurate version will be Neal's is directly descended from the Donner Party survivor. I have not found evidence to support direct descent. And this connection does not say anything meaningful about Neal's character. Historical trauma does not hinge as inherited culpability. Cannibalism is not a recessive gene. Marriage connection is not in the 19th century family tree does not explain the personality or actions of a living person. What it does explain is how a story like the Donner Party can enter family lore. Someone may say we're related to someone in the Donner Party. Over generations, related by marriage to a survivor can be descended from the Donner Party. A shorter story is easier to remember. It's also less accurate. Chapter 18, what the story is actually about. The Donner Party, remember has cannibalism, but cannibalism does not explain why the story remains culturally powerful. A deeper story is not about how catastrophe is produced. A promoter advertised an efficiency-treated shortcut. Travelers trusted information they cannot independently verify. Our group continued after the promised expert disappeared. Time losses accumulated. Animal supplies were treated as replaceable until they were gone. Social trust weakened. Class and kinships shaped access to protection. Indigenous people provided assistance but remained expendable within the settlers' hierarchy. Rescuers came late and in insufficient stages. The press converted trauma into spectacle. None of these forces alone created the disaster. Together they were removed by every remaining alternative. That's what makes the Donner Party disturbing. The people involved did not begin as monsters. They did not wake up one morning and anonymously decide to abandon civilization. They adapted gradually. First they changed the route. Then they abandoned property. Then they slaughtered the animals. Then they ate the hides. Then they produced the bones. Then they consumed people who already died. And eventually people were killed. Every step existed beyond the previous boundary, unimaginable through repetition. Conclusion. When people hear the word Donner Party, they usually think they already know the story. Snow, starvation, cannibalism, but those are not the final nouns. They are the explanation. Explanation involves misinformation, status, family structure, colonial expansion, environmental limits, and the human ability to normalize everything, where the alternatives disappear slowly enough. The cooking methods reveal physical desperation. Hides were softened and boiled. Bones were smashed, burned, and boiled for grease. Human remains were reportedly roasted, boiled, and dried, otherwise prepared according to circumstance. Archaeology confirms extreme processing even when it cannot confirm historical obligations. The genealogy reveals that the event continued even after survivors left the mountains. Lavina Graves survived as a child, married John Cyrus, became connected to the marriage of the family line led Neal D. Knight. Not a direct ancestor, a distant grandaunt by marriage, a real connection, but more complicated one than family lore usually preserves. And that may be the one of the most appropriate endings for a story like this. The Donner Party has always survived through simplification. A shortcut becomes a bad decision. A diverse group becomes the cannibals. A connection by marriage becomes a direct heritage. But the closer we examine the evidence, the less simple the story becomes. They did not suddenly become the Donner Party. They became the Donner Party, one decision at a time. Thank you. The spectacle requires spectators.